first time I saw the house, I felt the air shift around me, as if the world itself had held its breath. It wasn't an ordinary house. It was frozen in a moment I couldn't yet name. The paint, faded and peeling, clung stubbornly to the walls like memories refusing to die. The windows, grimy and clouded, reflected not just the sun, but a kind of emptiness, a void that whispered of things that should have stayed buried. Locals avoided it, and the rare few who mentioned it spoke in hushed tones, as if the words themselves could awaken something long dormant. Yet, for reasons I couldn't explain, I was drawn to it, pulled as if by some invisible thread, tied to the very fabric of the house itself. As I approached, the air grew heavier, thicker, almost viscous, wrapping around my chest like a vice. I pressed my hand to the weathered door, and for a moment I thought I felt the heartbeat of the house. Slow, deliberate, and unbearably lonely. The keyhole was dark, hollow, and inviting. It seemed to promise answers. Yet I knew I wasn't just opening a door to a building. I was stepping into decades of sorrow, into lives paused in moments of fear and despair. Inside, the house smelled of old wood, damp stone, and something faintly metallic, almost like dried blood. Dust floated lazily in the air, disturbed only by the faintest draft that seemed to come from nowhere. The furniture, draped in white sheets, looked like ghostly specters, frozen mid-motion, mid-thought, mid-life. In the hallway, an old clock ticked, or perhaps it didn't. Its hands were stuck at 7:42, a time that would later reveal itself as the hour. Everything changed. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, scattering colors across the floor. Yet even this beauty had a static, frozen quality, as if captured by a camera that never moved. I wandered through the rooms, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. There were photographs on the walls, some black and white, some faded color, all showing faces filled with joy, sorrow, or something in between, but all of them caught mid-expression, unnaturally still. Each frame seemed alive, as if the eyes followed me, trying to warn me, or perhaps to plead. On the mantel I found a diary, its cover cracked and worn. I hesitated, knowing instinctively that this book held secrets too terrible to be ignored. Opening it, I discovered the story of the family who had lived here, a lineage of misfortune, stretching back 3 generations. They were ordinary people once, with laughter, dreams, and love, but the house had other plans. Every page, written in a careful, spidery hand, detailed moments of inexplicable tragedy. A child vanishing in the garden, a mother found collapsed in the parlor, a father gone without a trace. Each entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the author had been interrupted by something unspeakable. I felt a chill as I read further. The diary spoke of time itself, acting against the family, days that passed without sunrise, hours that dragged endlessly, clocks that refused to tick forward. It was as though the house had trapped them in its own cruel dimension, bending reality around them. No one left alive, and those who remained slowly disappeared from the records, leaving only whispers and rumors in the town below. A sudden sound jolted me, a door creaking shut somewhere deep within the house. My heart raced. I wasn't alert. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. I realized that this house didn't just keep time. It kept souls feeding off their despair, their fear, their longing to escape. I had entered a world suspended, a trap set for anyone curious enough to step inside. Despite the terror, I felt compelled to explore further, as if drawn by the same invisible thread that had led me to the door. In the library, the air was thick, and books lay strewn about, pages torn, ink smeared. Some contained family records, detailing names and dates, but the ink faded the closer I examined the stories of their deaths. Each record ended at 7:42, The same time marked on the stopped clock. It was as if time itself had chosen that hour as a boundary, a wall no one could cross. Then I noticed them. Handprints on the walls, faint, almost erased by time, but undeniably there. Small, adult, child, dozens of them layered atop one another, climbing the walls in silent protest. I traced them with trembling fingers. They were cold, not just physically, but emotionally, as though carrying centuries of fear. The house had collected them all, a museum of anguish, a monument to lives paused forever. Outside, the wind rose carrying whispers, unintelligible, but urgent. They seemed to be warning me, guiding me, yet every instinct screamed that leaving would be impossible once I had truly seen the truth. And then from the attic above, a slow, deliberate creak began. Footsteps, or something heavier. My pulse quickened, and a sense of inevitability settled over me. The diary trembled in my hands, pages fluttering as if alive, directing me, showing me the path I could not refuse. I knew in that instant that this house had chosen me, not by chance, but by destiny. My own fate was now tied to the tragic legacy of those who had come before. And as the light faded from the room, shadows coalescing around me, I realized the terrifying truth. Time had stopped here, for a reason, and it would not let me go without claiming its due. The attic above seemed endless, a cavern of forgotten belongings and secrets too heavy to be left behind. Each step I took, on the creaking wooden stairs, sent tremors through the floor, echoing like whispers in the emptiness. The walls, dark with age and neglect, seemed to bend toward me, pressing with an invisible weight, urging me to turn back. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, pushed me forward. At the top I found a door partially ajar, the wood splintered and aged, its hinges groaning like a sigh of surrender. The faint light spilling from the crack illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, like tiny ghosts of the past. I hesitated, hand on the knob, feeling the chill that radiated from behind the door. I had no idea what I would find, yet some part of me already knew. The house had been waiting for me to arrive here, to witness what it had concealed for decades. Inside, the attic was filled with trunks and boxes, old furniture stacked haphazardly, and the remnants of a family's once vibrant life. Clothes yellowed with age, photographs curled at the edges, and toys, long forgotten, lay scattered across the floor. It was a museum of abandonment, a tomb not just of objects, but of memories. I noticed a small trunk in the corner, its lock rusted, but intact. Kneeling, I pried it open, revealing a collection of letters, brittle with age, tied together with faded ribbon. As I carefully unfolded the first letter, my breath caught. The handwriting was delicate, precise, almost trembling, and the words painted a picture of a family living in a slow, unrelenting nightmare. The letters spoke of unexplained disappearances, doors that would lock themselves, clocks that refused to tick forward, and shadows that moved without body. Each sentence carried a weight of fear and resignation, a testament to the fact that the family had known long before the townspeople whispered that something unnatural haunted their home. One letter, in particular, was different. The ink was darker, fresher than the others, and the words seemed almost urgent. If anyone finds this, understand that the house is alive. It watches, it remembers. Do not linger, it will not let you leave. I felt a chill that made my skin crawl. The letters were a warning, yet reading them now, I realized that warnings in this house were useless. The house didn't care. The house only collected and consumed. A sudden sound, a soft scratching, made me freeze. It came from a far corner of the attic, behind the stacked furniture. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my ears, louder than any creak of the old building. I strained my eyes, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond a few feet. Slowly, I stepped forward, my hand brushing against a stack of boxes, and the scratching stopped abrupt. Silence followed, but it was heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Then I noticed something else. The shadows. They weren't ordinary shadows cast by the dim light. These moved independently, flickering and stretching along the walls, as if alive. I tried to rationalize it. Trick of the light, dust, fatigue. But deep down I knew it wasn't my imagination. The house had always been a keeper of souls, and these shadows were echoes of the family who had suffered here. Their fear had lingered, etched into the very walls, unwilling to dissipate even after death. I felt compelled to follow them. Each shadow seemed to guide me toward a corner of the attic I hadn't explored. There, beneath a tattered sheet, I discovered an old mirror, cracked and warped. I lifted the sheet, and my reflection stared back. But something was wrong. Behind my face, in the mirror's depths, flickered images of the family, children peering through windows, parents frozen in terror, a figure disappearing into the darkness. I stumbled back, heart racing, and realized that the mirror was not merely reflective. It was a window into the house's memory, a record of every tragedy it had consumed. Shaking, I turned away and noticed another trunk, larger, reinforced with iron bars. The lock was intact, but I found a key hidden beneath a loose floorboard nearby. Unlocking it, I discovered items that spoke of rituals, of desperate attempts to protect the family from whatever had cursed them. Candles, dried herbs, symbols etched into parchment, all meant to ward off the darkness, to keep it from claiming more lives. But the letters had made it clear, no protection was strong enough. The house was patient, methodical, and eternal. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that attic. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps seconds. I could no longer tell, nor did I want to. My pulse had slowed, replaced by a steady, rhythmic terror. I knew the family had once hoped that someone would come, someone curious enough to understand what had happened, yet strong enough to escape. I wasn't sure I qualified on either count. The house tested those who entered, measured their resolve, and now it was judging me. Then I saw it, a small journal, tucked beneath the edge of the trunk. Its cover was blackened, edges frayed, as if burned at some point, and partially restored. The handwriting inside was jagged, almost frantic. It chronicled the final days of the Van Horn family, their last attempts to escape, their whispered prayers, their moments of madness. And then abruptly, the entries stopped. No farewell, no closure, only empty pages that seemed to stretch infinitely, as if the house itself had swallowed the conclusion. A sudden draft swept through the attic, extinguishing the few candles that had remained. Darkness enveloped me, thicker than anything I had ever experienced. The shadows pressed closer, moving with intent, almost as if alive. I realized then that the house had noticed me, acknowledged me, and now sought to decide my fate. My only choice was to move forward, to explore the depths of its secrets, and confront the horrors it had preserved for so long. I picked up the journal, my fingers trembling, and turned toward the attic stairs. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, seemed amplified, as if warning me not to descend. Yet, descending was the only way to understand, the only way to piece together the family's tragic story. The house had paused their lives, but it had also paused history itself within its walls. And now, I was part of that pause, teetering on the edge of revelation and ruin. Descending the attic stairs, I felt the house shift around me. The wood groaned, not with age alone but as though the very structure were alive, exhaling in response to my presence. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching and recoiling with each movement I made, as if the walls themselves were aware of my intrusion. I gripped the journal tightly, its brittle pages a fragile shield against the unknown. In the main hallway, the air was thick, heavy with dust, but also something else, an almost tangible sorrow, a weight that pressed against my chest. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked with a language of their own, conveying warnings in groans and moans that sent shivers down my spine. I moved cautiously, each step measured, each breath deliberate, because the house was patient. It would not rush, but it would remember. Every sound I made, every flicker of light, became part of its memory, another note in the symphony of fear that had long haunted this place. I paused outside a door that led to what had once been the family's parlor. The faded wallpaper peeled like curled leaves,
revealing streaks of water damage and shadows darker than the rest of the room. Furniture was overturned, dust-covered, and time-worn, each object frozen in the moment it had been abandoned. I could almost hear the echoes of laughter and arguments that had once filled this space, now twisted into hollow whisper. As I stepped inside, a cold breeze brushed my neck. Though all windows were shut, the journal in my hands trembled slightly, as if responding to the atmosphere around. The entries I had read in the attic suggested that the family had begun to notice the subtle signs, the whispers, the moving shadows, the objects that shifted when no one was watching. They had tried to ignore it at first, attributing it to imagination, to stress, to exhaustion. But the house had a way of making disbelief impossible. I approached the fireplace, its hearth blackened with soot long since cooled, and found a photograph on the mantel. The edges were curled, the surface cracked, but the image remained clear. A family of 5 smiling, unaware of the darkness that awaited them. Something about the photograph felt wrong. The father's eyes seemed too intense, the mother's smile too rigid, the children's faces almost still. I picked it up, and a chill ran through my fingers. The house had marked them, captured their essence, preserving it in objects like this photograph, a record of life before it was claimed by fear. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper from the corner of the room. "Don't stay." My heart jumped, and I spun around, but the room appeared empty. The shadows, however, seemed to move in response, pulling closer to the walls, stretching toward the ceiling. I realized that the house did not need a mouth to speak. It communicated through atmosphere, through the subtle shift of air, the temperature, the trembling of objects. Every movement was a message, every sigh of wind a warning. I turned back to the journal, reading entries that described nights filled with inexplicable sounds, steps in the hallways, soft weeping from rooms that should have been empty, and doors that opened and closed on their own. The family had tried everything: lock doors, burn incense, pray aloud, but nothing could stop it. The house thrived on their fear, growing stronger with every heartbeat of terror. And then came the final entry, barely legible, ink smudged, as though the writer had been trembling. "We are trapped. The house watches. It knows what we think, what we feel. If anyone finds this, leave now, for it will not forgive curiosity." I set the journal down, my hands shaking, and explored further. The dining room, once grand, was now a tableau of decay. Chairs lay overturned, the table split and warped, plates, broken and dusty, were scattered across the floor. I imagined the family here, attempting a meal while shadows crept in, silently observing. The thought made my stomach turn. How long had they endured this torment before surrendering to despair? How long before they vanished from the world entirely, leaving only echoes in the wall? A sudden draft extinguished the faint candle I had lit, plunging the room into darkness. I froze, realizing that the shadows were no longer content to stay in the corners. They moved with intent, coalescing into vague forms that resembled figures in motion. I could see hints of faces, blurred and incomplete, yet hauntingly familiar. I whispered, almost to myself, "Who are you?" And one voice, soft and brittle, replied, "We tried." The rest was swallowed by silence.
The staircase to the basement loomed ahead, partially hidden behind a tattered curtain. The journal had mentioned the cellar only once, in a hurried, panicked note. The basement, never go. They are there. My curiosity, or perhaps an irrational sense of duty, urged me forward. Every step toward the darkened doorway was accompanied by a thrum in my chest, a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the house itself. In the basement, the air was damp, musty, and thick with the scent of mold and decay. The floor was uneven, the walls lined with remnants of forgotten belongings, and in the far corner, I saw it, a door reinforced with heavy iron, chained and padlocked. The house had saved its most guarded secret for last. I could sense it even before opening the door, the presence of something that did not belong to this world. I removed the lock with a crowbar I had found in the attic, the metal groaning in protest. As the door creaked open, a gust of frigid air swept out, carrying whispers and murmurs, a symphony of voices long silenced. Inside, the space was small, confined, and filled with objects that suggested attempts to contain something powerful, something dangerous. Candles had melted into strange shapes, symbols were etched into the floor, and the air seemed charged with electricity. I realized then that the family had known the truth long before the world did. The house was not merely haunted, it was a trap, a vessel of lingering fear, feeding on the lives and emotions of those who dared to dwell within its walls. And the family, for all their love and courage, had been powerless. The shadows, the whispers, the moving objects, they were extensions of the house itself, forever claiming those who entered, until only the memory of terror remained. I stayed in the basement longer than I had intended, feeling the oppressive atmosphere settle into my bones. Every object, every shadow seemed alive with memories, memories that were not mine but belonged to the family that had vanished within these walls. Their fear, their despair, their fleeting moments of joy, all of it lingered, woven into the very fabric of the house. I pressed the journal to my chest, as if it could protect me from the invisible weight pressing down from above. Stepping out of the basement, the staircase felt steeper, narrower, more menacing than before. I realized that every part of the house had a purpose, each room a stage upon which the family's life had been dissected and observed. I ascended slowly, feeling the energy of the house intensify with each step. The hallway stretched before me, walls darker than I remembered, the floorboards groaning as if warning me not to proceed. In the parlor, the atmosphere had shifted. It was quieter now, but the quiet was deceptive, almost deliberate. I traced my fingers along the cracked mantelpiece, feeling the residual warmth of a presence that had once lived here. The photograph I had found earlier lay on the floor, as if fallen by its own accord. I picked it up again, studying the face. The more I stared, the more I noticed subtle distortions, almost like the shadows had etched themselves onto the paper, leaving behind an imprint of what had occurred in this room. The dining room had not changed much, yet it felt more alive. The broken chairs seemed to lean toward me, the warped table stretching like a skeletal hand, reaching for something unattainable. I could almost hear whispers of a family meal, fragments of laughter, and arguments mingling in the air. It was a haunting symphony, a record of life that had been suspended in time, held captive by the walls themselves. I moved toward the master bedroom, the entryway almost pulsating with anticipation. The journal had hinted at this room more than any other, detailing events that were never spoken aloud, secrets that the family had tried to hide, even from one another. The bed was unmade, sheets twisted as though someone had struggled violently, or perhaps simply in terror. Dust covered the furniture in a layer so thick it seemed as though time itself had been frozen. On the nightstand, I found a letter, yellowed with age, and brittle at the edges. The handwriting was hurried, desperate, the ink blotched in places as if tears had fallen upon it. It spoke of strange occurrences, voices that echoed in empty rooms, objects that moved of their own accord, and the suffocating sensation of being constantly watched. The final lines were nearly illegible, a warning scrawled in trembling letters. We cannot escape. The house, it is aware of us. It waits for the next moment to claim us. I could feel the gravity of the words pressing against me, the same sense of inevitability that the family must have felt. The walls seemed to close in, tightening around me, whispering my name softly, deliberate. I realized that the house had a memory, a consciousness perhaps, born from the anguish of those it had consumed. It remembered the family, their habits, their fears, and it had used those memories to trap them completely. I approached the window and peered out at the ground. The garden had grown wild, untamed, as though the house had rejected anything resembling life beyond its walls. Trees twisted unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky, and the lawn was littered with remnants of what had once been carefully maintained. The scene was eerie,
yet familiar. It mirrored the state of the family within, a beauty frozen, distorted by neglect and fear. A sudden creak behind me made me spin around. The closet door was ajar, and inside the air was cooler, almost breathable in contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the room. I stepped closer, compelled by a mixture of dread and curiosity. Inside I found remnants of childhood toys, an abandoned doll, a broken music box, a small chair turned on its side. The innocence of these items clashed violently with the malevolent energy that permeated the house, a stark reminder of lives interrupted, of childhood stolen by unseen forces. I noticed too, the walls of the room were lined with strange etched symbols, marks and scratches, some barely visible, others deep and pronounced. The journal had mentioned them vaguely, describing the family's attempts to mark their environment, to assert control over the chaos that engulfed them. But these symbols did not protect. They chronicled, they warned, they pleaded with anyone who might come after. I traced my fingers along the etchings, feeling the vibrations of the past, as if the house itself was pulsing with memory and grief. The atmosphere shifted again. The shadows in the room began to move, not randomly, but with intent. They swirled around the corners, pooling near the ceiling, stretching toward the floor. I felt a presence, unseeable yet palpable, as though someone or something was standing just beyond the edge of vision, observing, judging. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath came in visible puffs, hanging in the air like specters of the past. I turned back to the journal, reading aloud passages that had been previously overlooked. Words described events that defied explanation, objects levitating, sounds of footsteps when no one was there, whispers that spoke in the family's voices, recounting arguments, secrets, regret. I realized with a chill that the house had not merely witnessed these events, it had recorded them, folded them into its structure, and now replayed them through every creaking board, every shifting shadow, every flicker of air. Night fell, or perhaps it never had truly left. The room grew darker, shadows merging into solid forms. I felt their gaze upon me, their collective attention stretching across the years, judging the intruder who dared to witness their suffering. And in that moment, I understood why no one could stay. The house was not just a building, it was a sentinel of fear, a collector of souls, and an eternal reminder that some places are cursed, not by rumor, but by the weight of truth. I could feel the house's presence more acutely now than ever before. Each step I took seemed to echo not merely in sound, but in intention, as though the floorboards themselves were assessing me, testing my resolve. The corridors twisted around me like living veins, dark and foreboding, guiding me toward a part of the house that I could no longer avoid. The attic, I realized, had been waiting for me all along, a chamber that held answers the family had never spoken aloud, secrets that had festered beneath layers of dust and silence. Ascending the narrow staircase, the air grew colder still, frost clinging to the edges of the railing, as though time itself had hardened. My breath puffed in front of me, and for the first time, I felt a sense of isolation that was absolute. The walls seemed to thrum with a pulse, not mine, but theirs, the family whose lives had ended here, whose despair had been absorbed by these very boards, their suffering frozen in the air. Each step was an act of daring, an intrusion into a world that had long since closed itself off from the outside. The attic door was heavy, warped from years of neglect. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges streaking in protest. Inside, the space was small, the slanted roof pressing down as though the house itself sought to suffocate anyone who dared enter. Dust motes floated lazily in the thin shafts of light that fell through the lone window. Yet, even in this oppressive quiet, there was an energy, a vibration that prickled my skin. I could feel it in my bones. The memories, the echoes of the family, and the darkness they had tried in vain to escape. On the floor lay a chest, ancient and splintered, bound with iron straps blackened with age. I approached it cautiously, heart hammering in my chest. aware that every fiber of this house was aware of my intrusion. The lock was rusted but fragile, and with a tentative pull it gave way with a metallic groan. Inside were objects that belonged to the family, letters tied with brittle ribbon, photographs yellowed with time, and trinkets that seemed mundane until one considered the weight of the lives they represented. I lifted a photograph, studying it closely. The family, smiling, captured in an instant of normalcy that no longer existed. The edges of the photograph were curled, shadows obscuring faces in ways that felt deliberate, like the house had tried to hide something even within this frozen memory. I opened a letter, the handwriting frantic, uneven, desperation leaking from each stroke. It recounted events that defied logic, doors that slammed themselves, voices in the night, fleeting figures glimpsed from the corner of an eye, and the oppressive sensation that something was always watching. As I delved deeper into the chest, I found a small journal, leather-bound and worn, the pages delicate. The entries were fragmented, full of fear, confusion, and a creeping sense of doom. The writer spoke of a presence that began subtly, a chill in the air, a whisper in the darkness, but grew increasingly malevolent with each passing day. It was clear that the family had attempted to chronicle their experiences, to make sense of a force that was beyond comprehension. Yet, the more they wrote, the more the house seemed to tighten its grip, as though the act of documenting its horrors gave it life. One entry in particular stood out, its words scrawled with a fury born of terror. The house remembers everything, every word, every breath, every secret. We thought we could hide, but it sees all. We are not alone, and we cannot leave. It waits for the next to falter, the next to succumb. I shivered, feeling the weight of the sentence settle in my chest. It was not merely the house they feared, but the awareness within it, the intelligence that thrived on their anguish. I set the journal aside and looked around the attic. Shadows pooled in corners, seemingly more substantial than the light could tell. The objects in the chest, the toys, the letters, even the floorboards themselves, all seemed imbued with a consciousness that was quietly calculating, waiting for a misstep. The house was patient, deliberate, and I understood then why no one could escape its grasp. Its memory, its awareness, made it a predator, unlike any other, one that did not need to move or speak to terrify. A sudden noise made me jump, a soft, dragging sound from the far corner of the attic. I froze, straining to see through the gloom. Slowly, a small wooden chair began to rock back and forth, as if moved by a hand unseen. The motion was hypnotic, terrifying in its simplicity. I realized then that the house did not need ghosts to scare. It used the objects themselves, the environment as instruments of dread. Every creak, every movement, was a message, a reminder that this space had its own life, one that was fed by the fear of those who entered. I approached the chair, cautiously, heart racing, and noticed markings along the floor, scratches and grooves etched deep into the wood. They formed symbols, patterns that were repeated throughout the house unnoticed until now. The family had tried to communicate through them, perhaps to ward off the malevolence, perhaps to leave warnings for anyone who might come after. I traced the symbols with my fingers, feeling the vibrations of fear, of frantic energy, lingering in the grain of the wood. Time became meaningless. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps they had been years. I could not. The attic seemed to expand and contract, breathing around me, alive in ways that defied logic. I realized the family had been caught in this temporal distortion, their lives elongated, compressed, suspended within these walls. The house did not merely trap them physically, it had ensnared their perception, their consciousness, until all boundaries between past and present had blurred. A cold draft brushed past me, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, of extinguished light. The shadows shifted once more, coalescing near the window. I felt the presence, as if the house itself had reached out to observe, to test my resolve. I understood that leaving the attic would not end my ordeal. The house had recorded me the moment I stepped through its threshold. I was now part of its memory, another echo in its endless gallery of despair. I gathered the letters and photographs, careful not to disturb anything else, and made my way back toward the stairwell. Every step was an act of defiance, a challenge to the house that had claimed so many. Yet, I knew that my understanding of its power did not grant me immunity. The air was thick, almost viscous, pressing against me as I descended. I felt eyes upon me, watching, judging, remembering. I could not shake the realization that the house had absorbed a part of me, just as it had the family before me. When I finally emerged from the attic, the first rays of morning light pierced through the grimy windows. The world outside seemed impossibly bright, impossibly distant. I clutched the journal to my chest, the letters secured, knowing that what I carried was a fragment of the truth. A truth that the house would prefer remain hidden, that the family had failed to escape. And yet, I had glimpsed it, felt it, survived it, at least for now. Even after leaving the attic, the house seemed to follow me. Each hallway I passed, each room I entered, carried a residue of dread that clung to my clothes and skin. The walls themselves appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting ever so subtly, as if the house were alive, aware of my movements, assessing whether I had learned enough or too much. I understood then that escaping its grasp would not be a matter of leaving the building. The house had already claimed me in ways I could not yet comprehend. I returned to the main living room, hoping the familiar furniture and faded wallpaper might offer some comfort. It did. Shadows pooled in corners where sunlight should have touched, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and old decay. The furniture seemed rearranged, though I knew I had left it untouched, as if some unseen force had moved it while I slept, or perhaps while I thought I slept. The house had a memory, a will of its own, and it delighted in asserting both. At the slightest opportunity, I opened the journal again, seeking guidance, answers, anything to make sense of what I had witnessed. The entries became increasingly frantic, almost unreadable, as if written under duress or in a state of perpetual panic. One note described a family dinner, ordinary in all appearances, yet the writer recounted hearing whispers beneath the floorboards, voices that mimicked the family's own speech, whispering threats and revealing private thoughts. The psychological torment had been relentless, a constant reminder that there was no safety, no refuge.
Determined to confront the house rather than run from it, I began examining each room with a meticulous attention to detail. I traced the edges of door frames, tapped on walls, pressed my ear to the floorboards, and studied the ceilings. Each creak, each subtle shift in air pressure was significant. It was a language the house spoke fluently, one that the family had tried and failed to decode. I realized the house was not merely a vessel of fear. It was a teacher, and it used terror as its curriculum. The more I understood its methods, the more I sensed its intelligence. It adapted, anticipated, responded to curiosity with challenge, and punished complacency with subtle cruelty. In what had once been the children's playroom, I discovered remnants of what they had left behind: torn books, shattered toys, a doll with one glassy eye missing. The diary entries had mentioned these objects, describing them as conduits for the house's influence. The children's toys were no longer innocent. They had become instruments in the web of fear the house wove. I could almost see the lingering energy, a faint shimmer of light and shadow twisting above the floorboards, marking the presence of lives disrupted, innocence stolen. I paused by a small wooden chest in the corner, its surface covered in scratches, as if clawed by frantic hands. Inside were letters from neighbors, friends, and distant relatives, all recounting subtle, unexplained events, items misplaced, sounds in the night, fleeting glimpses of figures that disappeared when approached. The house's influence was not confined to its walls. It reached outward, touching those who came close, leaving traces of unease that could never be fully explained. The Van Horn family had endured it. The previous inhabitants had endured it, and now I stood in the same web, aware that the chain of torment extended beyond the home itself. A sudden creak drew my attention to the staircase leading to the basement. The door had been closed, locked for decades. Yet here it was, slightly ajar, as though inviting or daring me to descend. I knew instinctively that this was no ordinary basement. The family's journal had spoken of hidden rooms, secret compartments, and places where the house's influence was strongest. With cautious steps, I approached, feeling a cold draft seep from the narrow opening, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of earth, decay, and something older, something far older than the house itself. The basement staircase descended steeply into darkness. Each step groaned beneath my weight, echoing down into the void, amplifying the tension that had been building since I first set foot in this house. I felt as though the walls themselves were pressing inward, narrowing the passage, trying to make escape impossible before I even entered. At the bottom, the basement opened into a small chamber. Walls lined with shelves, old jars, tools, and crates filled the room. But it was the symbols etched into the stone floor that drew my gaze. The markings were intricate, geometric, and unnervingly precise. They formed patterns that suggested not merely decoration, but intent, as though the previous inhabitants had attempted to create a barrier, a protective sigil, or perhaps a warning. The journal confirmed my suspicion. The family had tried to protect themselves, to ward off the malevolence that had begun when the house claimed its first victims. Yet the more I studied the symbols, the more I felt the house's response. Subtle vibrations beneath my feet, a whispering that was almost intelligible, like the house was acknowledging my presence and assessing whether I would survive this confrontation. Objects on the shelves seemed to pulse with energy. Books bound in worn leather exuded a faint heat. Jars rattled lightly despite no breeze, and shadows shifted unnaturally against the walls. I could feel the house feeding on my curiosity, feeding on my need to understand. The journal had warned against lingering too long in these spaces, yet I could not tear myself away. I had come too far to retreat. I needed to see to understand, and perhaps to survive. The chamber led to another doorway, narrower, hidden behind a stack of crates. Beyond it was a room that had likely never been touched by human hands for decades. The air here was denser, the darkness heavier. I could sense the history embedded in every stone, every splintered beam. And in the center of the room, a small table held objects that seemed impossibly out of place. An old photograph, a single glove, a ring, and a folded piece of paper. These items were relics of a family long gone, items that had been left intentionally, perhaps as a message or a trap. I reached for the folded paper, careful not to disturb anything else. Unfolding it, I found handwriting that was barely legible, trembling as if penned in fear or haste. The note contained a warning and a confession. The house remembered, and the family's attempts to defy it had only strengthened its presence. They had hidden what they could, leaving clues for any who might come after. Yet the full truth was beyond explanation. They begged the reader to leave, to never return. For the house did not forgive, and it did not forget. As I absorbed the warning, a shiver ran down my spine. The house's energy was palpable, a weight pressing on my shoulders, seeping into my mind. I understood then why the family had perished here, why others had vanished, and why the house retained its dreadful power over all who entered. Knowledge alone was no protection. Understanding was not enough. Survival required something deeper. Respect, caution, and an awareness that this place was older, smarter, and more relentless than any human mind could comprehend. Even after encountering the hidden chamber and the house's warning, I could not leave. Some force rooted me in place. A combination of morbid curiosity and the unshakable need to understand the full extent of what had transpired here. The basement felt alive, almost sentient, and each breath I drew carried the heavy damp scent of age, wood, and an almost imperceptible metallic tang that suggested the presence of something long decayed. The house had been patient for decades, and I sensed it had been waiting for someone like me, someone willing to see,
willing to feel, willing to confront the darkness. I retraced my steps back toward the main hall, each creaking floorboard echoing like the hollow toll of a bell, marking my descent into deeper understanding. The walls seemed to lean inward, a physical manifestation of the oppressive atmosphere. I began noticing details I had previously missed: faint scratches on door frames, impressions in the carpet where furniture had been moved, and whispers that lingered just below the threshold of hearing, teasing, coaxing, daring me to follow. These were not merely echoes of the past. They were active, deliberate attempts by the house to communicate, or perhaps to manipulate. I moved toward the old study, a room lined with tall, sagging bookshelves, and a large, ornate desk. Sunlight filtered weakly through grimy windows, illuminating the motes of dust that floated in the still air like tiny specters. On the desk lay scattered papers and a journal, possibly belonging to the family patriarch, whose entries promised to reveal the inner workings of the house, its patterns, and its rules. I flipped through the pages, my eyes straining to read the delicate script, written decades ago yet preserved uncannily well. The entries recounted a family trying to navigate normal life, while under siege by an invisible force. Objects moved on their own. Strange sounds echoed through the corridors at night, and there were accounts of the children disappearing for brief periods, only to reappear without explanation, changed in subtle, unsettling ways. The father wrote about the fear that consumed him, the guilt that gnawed at him for not protecting his family, and a creeping realization that the house had its own agenda, separate from any human comprehension. One passage stood out. It described a ritual the family had attempted, a desperate act to appease the house, or perhaps to expel the presence they could not control. Candles had been arranged in complex patterns, symbols etched into the floors, and whispered incantations repeated at precise intervals. Despite their efforts, the journal revealed, the house remained indifferent, or worse, encouraged their failures, feeding on their fear, growing stronger as their panic escalated. The more they resisted, the deeper its influence became, until resistance itself became futile. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the house was not merely reactive. It was adaptive, intelligent, and patient. Every creak, every shadow, every cold draft was purposeful. The house had learned from its inhabitants, observed their weaknesses, and used those weaknesses against them. The diary described nights when the family felt watched even while they were alone, and days when the sun shone yet shadows remained unnaturally dark, hiding movements and figures that should not exist. The house had no end, no beginning. It was eternal in its own terrifying way. I wandered from room to room, absorbing these histories, and I began to understand the mechanics of the house's hold. The living areas seemed ordinary at first glance, but subtle details betrayed the presence of manipulation. Curtains moved without wind, floorboards shifted, paintings seemed to watch. The house had a rhythm, a pulse that synced with its inhabitants' emotions, intensifying fear when it sensed hesitation, offering false comfort when it wanted compliance. I realized that the family had been trapped not by walls or locks, but by the house's very awareness of their minds. In the dining room, the furniture told a story of chaos. Chairs were overturned, a table leg splintered, and silverware lay scattered as though a hurried struggle had taken place. The journal confirmed my suspicions. Meals had been disturbed, conversations interrupted by inexplicable noises, and family members often reported seeing one another move in unnatural ways, performing tasks they had no memory of. The house forced them into illusions, making them question their sanity, eroding trust between each other until unity dissolved entirely. I felt the weight of time pressing against me, as though the house itself existed outside normal chronology. Moments seemed to stretch, compress, and repeat, and I had the unnerving sense of having been in this room before, though logically I knew I had not. Shadows flickered in corners, and I could swear I saw figures moving just beyond my line of sight, ghosts, perhaps, or manifestations of the house's power. The journal hinted at such phenomena, noting that residents often encountered apparitions, fleeting glimpses of themselves or loved ones, distorted and grotesque, designed to manipulate and terrify. Determined to understand the true nature of the curse, I explored the attic again. The space was smaller than I remembered, its low beams pressing down, its floor littered with dust and debris. Here, the diary suggested, the house's influence was strongest, the culmination of years of entrapment and malevolent observation. I found remnants of clothing, toys, and old letters, evidence of the daily life that had once been interrupted and twisted. The energy here was almost tangible, heavy and suffocating, and I felt the house's awareness like a hand on my shoulder, guiding, testing, warning. Among the scattered objects, I discovered a small locked box, worn from age and marked with symbols similar to those I had seen in the basement. Inside were photographs, letters, and personal items, documenting moments of happiness before the house's influence became overwhelming. The items were ordinary, yet the context imbued them with dread. Each artifact seemed to hum with the tension of the family's final days, echoing the fear, confusion, and despair that had been cultivated so meticulously by the house. As I held these items, I began to comprehend the scope of the curse. This house did not merely consume time or space, it consumed lives, eroding identity, reshaping reality, and leaving behind fragments of memory and madness. The family's torment had been methodical, cumulative, a demonstration of power that transcended normal understanding, and I realized that my presence, my curiosity, had made me part of its ongoing story. The house had claimed me, in ways I could not yet measure, entwining me with its past, its secrets, and its continuing influence. The night settled like a heavy blanket, and the house seemed to breathe around me. The darkness wasn't merely absence of light, it was a living entity, curling into corners, pressing against walls, settling into the smallest crevices. I realized that the house had a memory of its own, an archive of fear and suffering, storing every misstep, every scream, every whispered plea of the family who had once lived here. Shadows seemed to shift purposefully, almost like sentient tendrils, probing, observing, marking my reaction. I felt like a visitor in a cathedral of horror, one where the echoes of the past were worshipped with meticulous precision. I tried to retrace the family's last days using the diary and the remnants of their lives I had gathered. They had tried to fight, to resist the influence of the house, but their efforts had been in vain. The house's intelligence was staggering, operating beyond simple mechanics, beyond any human comprehension. Its power grew with observation. It learned fear, honed strategies to exploit weaknesses, and used the family's love for one another against them. A mother's concern could be twisted into paranoia, a child's innocence into obedience to unseen forces. The library offered more clues. Books lined the walls, some intact, some tattered, their pages filled with forgotten knowledge, obscure rituals, and cryptic warnings. I could sense the intent behind their placement, the careful arrangement meant to intimidate, to obscure, and to manipulate. The family had once believed these volumes could hold the secret to resisting the house's dominion, but the diary revealed that their attempts only strengthened its grip. Knowledge in this place was both a tool and a trap, capable of illuminating truths that could destroy sanity if misapplied. I ventured toward the west wing, where the children's rooms remained frozen in a macabre tableau. Tiny beds sat under thin dust, toys scattered across the floor as if abandoned mid-play. The air here was thick with the residue of sorrow, the scent of old fabric, mingled with an indefinable heaviness that weighed upon the chest. I could almost hear the echoes of laughter twisted into cries, the whispers of innocent voices laced with fear. Here the house had perfected its cruelty, using familiar comforts as instruments of psychological torment. The diary hinted at nights when the children were found in corners, murmuring to unseen entities, their small hands clutching at air, their eyes wide with recognition of the invisible presence. As I explored, I felt moments stretch and collapse unpredictably, as though the house controlled the very flow of time within its walls. I passed through corridors that seemed familiar and unfamiliar simultaneously, rooms that appeared to move when unobserved, and doorways that led to unexpected places. The diary entries described the same phenomenon. The family had become disoriented, unable to discern night from day, reality from illusion. Time was a weapon here, bent to the house's will, eroding the mind slowly, systematic. In one corner I discovered a set of old photographs, faded but legible. They depicted the family at happier times, birthdays, holidays, ordinary moments now imbued with tragic irony. Each smile seemed forced in retrospect, a mask worn against the pervasive unease that had always lurked. The house, I realized, had documented everything, capturing memories and twisting them, replaying them as tools of torment. The images seemed to watch me, accusing, warning, urging me to leave, before I too became part of its record. I tried to map the house, to find patterns, to understand its logic. Hallways curved in impossible ways. Rooms existed that shouldn't. Doors led to places not indicated on any floor plan. The house was alive, expanding and contracting, reshaping itself subtly, anticipating my move. The diary revealed that the family had attempted to flee, but each escape attempt ended with them retracing steps they thought impossible, always led back into the heart of the house. It was a predator, patient and meticulous, ensuring that its victims remained trapped until their minds were fully surrendered. As the night deepened, I felt a presence I could not ignore, a cold, almost tangible awareness that followed my every step, mirroring my movements, slipping through shadows, and sometimes manifesting in reflections in dusty mirrors. The house remembered those who had been within it, and now I too was becoming a part of its history. Each breath I took, each step I made, was catalogued, adding to the tapestry of fear that had already been woven from generations of suffering.
I returned to the attic, seeking some piece of understanding, a key to escaping what the diary hinted could be inevitable. The air was colder here, more oppressive, almost viscous, resisting my movements. Objects that had been benign during the day now appeared threatening, cast in grotesque shadows that shifted and danced in unnatural patterns. I realized that the house's intelligence was not only reactive, but anticipatory. It seemed to manipulate my own perceptions, guiding me subtly toward discoveries that would terrify, confuse, and ensnare me. The journal's final entries were particularly haunting. They spoke of resignation, of the slow surrender to the house's will. The family had once tried to document everything, believing that understanding might grant freedom, but they failed. The diary concluded with fragmented thoughts, warnings and pleas to any future reader, hinting at both the house's cruelty and the inevitable fate of those who dared enter its domain unprepared. I understood then that knowledge alone was insufficient. The house demanded obedience, fear, and an understanding of its rules that no human could ever fully grasp. As I left the attic, the house seemed to sigh, a sound like wind through hollow bones, and I knew I had glimpsed only a fraction of its full capacity. The shadows had not yet released me, and the memories of the family I had read about were now intertwined with my own. Every corner I turned, every room I entered, felt like a continuation of a story that had begun long before I arrived, and would persist long after I departed. The house's intelligence, its malevolent patience, and its ability to manipulate time and perception had claimed the previous inhabitants, and I felt the creeping realization that I might be next, unless I found a way to resist or escape its pervasive control. The house seemed to pulse with life as I moved through its endless corridors, a rhythm that mimicked breathing, slow and deliberate, almost imperceptible yet profoundly unsettling. Every footstep I took was met with the echo of countless others, some real, some imagined, all blending into a symphony of lingering despair. I realized that the house was not merely a structure, it was an entity, absorbing the fears, memories, and anguish of every soul who had ever entered. Each wall, each floorboard, seemed saturated with emotion, vibrating with the echoes of the past. I reached the grand hall, a place that had once been magnificent, now distorted with shadows that clung to the ornate moldings like dark ivy. The chandeliers swayed slightly, though no breeze disturbed the air. The diary had warned that the house enjoyed reflection and misdirection, playing with one's mind by rearranging familiar spaces. I had begun to notice the subtle shifts, doors that led to the wrong rooms, stairs that descended but brought me to unfamiliar floors, mirrors that reflected moments from the family's past, instead of my own image. Every step I took felt like trespassing deeper into a consciousness that belonged solely to the house. The diary also mentioned the voices. I had thought them mere figments of my imagination, echoes of the family's recorded fears, but now I understood that the house was speaking in its own language, using memories as a medium. Whispers seeped from the walls, low and melodic, drawing me forward, promising secrets, warning me away. Sometimes the words were clear, other times they were garbled fragments, half-formed warnings that teased comprehension and teased terror. I pressed on, driven by curiosity, yet aware that the house fed off my very presence, learning, adapting, waiting for a misstep. The children's rooms, once untouched, revealed new horrors. Toys had shifted overnight, miniature chairs faced different directions, beds were strewn with dusty sheets that seemed to breathe when I approached. The diary's entries described the children as vessels of both innocence and terror, their fear harnessed by the house to ensnare the family further. I could feel that energy now, a subtle pull at the edges of perception, coaxing me into corridors I had not intended to explore, tempting me to confront phantoms I was not ready to face. In one room, I discovered a wall covered in scratches, marks left by desperate hands trying to claw through reality itself. The diary recounted nights where the family's children had attempted to communicate with each other through secret codes, but the house twisted those communications, creating confusion and despair. I traced the etchings with my fingers, feeling the faint warmth of a lingering presence, as if the room itself had absorbed the last moments of frantic hope, and now preserved it for eternity. The kitchen, once the heart of the home, now felt alien. The air smelled of decay, though nothing seemed to rot, a paradox that unsettled the senses. Cabinet doors opened slightly, drawers were left ajar, and I imagined the family preparing meals that were never eaten, their routines disrupted, their sanity fraying. The diary's notes suggested that the house delighted in routine only to distort it, to turn comfort into unease. Plates might move when unobserved, silverware might vanish, small signs meant to undermine reality and build reliance on the house's unpredictable rule. As I moved toward the basement, the house's control became more palpable. The temperature dropped sharply, each breath visible in the dim light, creating brief, ghostly clouds that hung in the air. The diary described this place as the heart of the house's power, where past tragedies were concentrated, where the essence of fear itself was distilled. Every step I took seemed echoed by another, heavier, slower, as if unseen feet followed me in perfect harmony with my own. I could feel the pressure of countless eyes, not just watching but analyzing, judging, ready to exploit any hesitation. I discovered remnants of the family's attempts to raise symbols scratched into walls, protective charms tucked into corners, handwritten notes detailing the house's patterns, all meant to create barriers against its influence. Yet the diary made it clear that these efforts only delayed the inevitable. The house was patient beyond human comprehension. It did not need to rush. It did not need to strike with immediate force. It thrived on gradual domination, a slow erosion of confidence, hope, and unity. Each failed attempt by the family strengthened its resolve, embedding their despair into the very structure. In the master bedroom, I found a mirror that reflected not my image but moments of the family's final days. I saw the mother pacing in quiet desperation, the father sitting in resigned silence, the children huddled together in fear. Time appeared fluid here, overlapping past and present, creating an almost unbearable layering of experience. The diary had mentioned these spaces, where the house allowed glimpses of history to remind occupants of their vulnerability. Witnessing these moments was intoxicating and horrifying, and I realized that the house used memory as both weapon and sustenance. Every corner I turned, every room I entered, intensified the feeling that the house had adopted me into its history. The whispers grew louder, the shadows more intricate, the sensation of unseen observers pressing close. The diary concluded that the house's victims were never truly gone. They were absorbed, transformed into tools, guides and warnings for the next unwitting explorers. I understood then that leaving the house did not guarantee freedom. Even if one survived physically, the mind could remain tethered to its corridors,
haunted by echoes that would never fade. By the time I reached the grand staircase, the house seemed to stretch beyond comprehension. I could not distinguish floor from ceiling, corridor from wall. The diary's warnings became chillingly clear. The house was not a place, but a continuum of experience, a living chronicle of fear, waiting for each visitor to contribute to its legacy. I felt the first stirrings of true dread, knowing that the family's tragedy was not merely historical, but a template, a method by which the house would test, torment, and claim any who dared enter. The final stretch of my journey through the house was suffused with a weight that pressed down not only on my body but on my very thoughts. Every room I passed whispered with voices that were simultaneously familiar and alien, memories of the family's last moments echoing in ways that challenged my perception of reality. I realized that the house's purpose was not merely to terrify, but to transform those who entered, reshaping consciousness, until fear became a constant companion, an inseparable part of existence. It was then I understood that my curiosity had already tethered me to it, that by entering, I had consented, even unknowingly, to the house's subtle domination. As I ascended to the attic, a place I had deliberately avoided until now, the final warnings in the diary seemed alive, crawling along the walls. The attic held the culmination of centuries of anguish, the distilled essence of the house's power. Sunlight filtering through the cracked roof only made the shadows sharper, more insidious. Objects long forgotten by the living remained in suspended animation. An old rocking horse frozen mid-sway, a cracked porcelain doll staring with wide, unblinking eyes, and a trunk that seemed to hum with a pulse that was neither mechanical nor organic. This was the epicenter, the threshold between the house's past horrors and my present exploration. The diary had made a crucial point clear. Those who entered the attic could see the truth of the house, but the truth was not comfort. It was merciless, revealing the mechanisms by which it consumed families, how it thrived on secrets, on shame, on the breakdown of trust and cohesion. I opened the trunk, its hinges protesting with a squeal that echoed through the attic, and found stacks of letters, yellowed and brittle with age. Each letter contained confessions, whispered fears, and desperate pleas, all written in the trembling hand of someone who had once lived under the house's roof. Reading them was like inhaling the collective despair of generations, a suffocating knowledge that weighed heavier with every word. Among the letters, I discovered a map of sorts, crudely drawn, showing hidden passages, secret chambers, and symbols meant to either guide or confuse. The diary had alluded to these, suggesting that understanding the house's layout was both impossible and necessary. I realized that the house deliberately concealed exits, twisted familiar corridors, and presented false doors, all as a means to trap its inhabitants psychologically, to make every choice a test of sanity and resolve. Following the map felt like navigating a labyrinth of memory and malevolence, each turn forcing me to confront echoes of past inhabitants, their regrets, and their moments of unrelenting fear. As I descended into the hidden chamber beneath the attic, I sensed that this was the repository of the house's deepest secrets. The air was thick and almost tangible, filled with an energy that felt both alive and predatory. I could almost hear the house breathing, each inhalation resonating through the floorboards, each exhalation whispering warnings of the dangers of curiosity. The diary had repeatedly emphasized that the house fed on observation, that it grew stronger with attention and fear. I understood then that to leave, I would need to resist the instinct to look too closely, to observe too deeply, yet my human nature made this nearly impossible. In the center of the chamber lay a circular arrangement of objects, a cracked mirror, a rusted key, a candle that had burned to its base, and a small, intricately carved box. It was the box that had held the family's most terrible secret, the item referenced repeatedly in the diary but never fully explained. I hesitated, knowing that to open it would either release the culmination of the house's influence, or grant the final understanding of its power. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid, and a cold wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the candle instantly, plunging me into darkness. The contents were simple yet horrifying, a collection of personal items, small tokens of love, hope and despair, each inscribed with names, dates and warnings. It became clear that these were not merely objects, but vessels, imbued with the lingering essence of the family's final moment. The house seemed to react to my discovery, groaning and shivering, as if acknowledging that its deepest secret had been uncovered. The air thickened, oppressive and electric, and I could feel a pull, an irresistible draw toward the center of the chamber. The diary's final note had warned of this, of the inevitable confrontation with the house itself, a choice between succumbing to its influence, or forcing oneself to leave, carrying the memory, but not the essence. I felt every instinct screaming to flee, yet each step toward the exit was met with resistance, a psychological gravity that made motion slow and agonizing. I finally emerged from the chamber, the attic stretching endlessly above me, shadows reaching like hands, pulling, testing my resolve. The map had proven invaluable, guiding me through hidden passages and past rooms, where the house attempted to mislead me with phantoms and false reflection. I moved swiftly but cautiously, knowing that the house's true power lay in subtlety, in the accumulation of fear, in the psychological toll of constant uncertainty. I reminded myself of every lesson the diary had imparted. The house thrived on isolation, on internal conflict, and on the erosion of trust. I had none of these to betray me, yet I felt the weight of history pressing down. Finally the front door appeared, faint light streaming through its glass panels. Relief surged, but it was tempered with caution. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, inhaling the fresh air with a sense of disbelief. The house loomed behind me, silent, waiting, as if judging my success, and mentally preparing for the next intrude. I realized that while I had left its physical space, a part of its influence had followed, subtle and persistent, a reminder that one can escape location but not entirely escape legacy. The house had claimed the Van Horn family, had etched its will across generations, and yet it remained undisturbed by time, a sentinel of memory and fear. I understood then that my role had shifted from explorer to storyteller, a custodian of its story, sharing the warnings and revelations, so that others might approach with respect, caution and awareness. The diary would continue to be a guide, but the house itself would always remain a challenge to human comprehension. As I walked away, the wind carried faint whispers, almost intelligible, like the house bidding farewell or promising its next engagement. The experience left me with a profound understanding of the power of place, the weight of history, and the haunting persistence of unresolved secrets. I knew that some memories, some legacies, could never be erased, and that the house would always remain, waiting for its next encounter, timeless, patient, and eternally alive. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries that will keep you on the edge of your seat.